The oil pan gasket. This is something that every single E90 is inevitably going to have to deal with. Question is this something that an average Joe can do, or is this a repair job that you really need to take to a professional mechanic to get done? A mechanic's going to charge you somewhere around $1,000 to get this repair done, and the parts themselves cost less than $100 for a new set of bolts, new gasket, and an oil level sensor O-ring. Is all that money that you're spending on labor for a mechanic, is that skilled labor, or is it non-skilled and very just time-consuming labor? Well, I want to answer that question and say that it is just very time-consuming labor. There's a lot of steps involved, a lot of nuts and bolts to take off the car. You got to support the engine from the top, but other than that, it doesn't require a whole lot of technical knowledge. Which leads me to say that you absolutely can do this oil pan gasket replacement. With the right time, space, tools, and preparation, you absolutely can do this oil pan gasket replacement. I was able to do mine a few weeks ago. It went fairly smoothly. I got some footage of me doing that, but I didn't capture enough to make a full video. Luckily, I have to go in and replace an engine mount, so I'm gonna have to drop the subframe again, doing the exact same procedural steps you need to do to drop the subframe to get access to that oil pan. So I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to make a video, share my experience doing the oil pan gasket for the very first time. I'm going to give you some pieces of advice that helped me get through this repair. I'm going to tell you all the tools that I used. I'm going to walk through a modified DIY. And lastly, I'm going to give you some torque specs at the end when reassembling your car. So I really hope this video gives you confidence to think about taking on the oil pan gasket replacement. Without further ado, let's get started. Preparation. Just watch hours and hours of YouTube video. This is really going to help you familiarize yourself with all of the procedural steps to drop the subframe to get access to that oil pan. It's really going to relieve the amount of fear and anxiety you have from thinking about taking on a project like this, because you're going to mentally prepare yourself. So that would be my number one recommendation, is preparation. Make sure you purchase the correct oil pan bolts. There are different sets of oil pan bolts for automatic and manual transmission. The best way to ensure you have the correct parts is to go to realoem.com, plug in your VIN, and then find your parts from there. I would catalog every single nut and bolt that comes off the car. So after you take a nut or bolt off of the car, grab yourself some Ziploc bags and a Sharpie, put the nut or bolt into the Ziploc bag, write down what it is, where it came from, and what socket size or wrench size you used, and then put this in a safe place. Write down every single step you take during this repair. And this will just pay huge dividends on the back end when you're reassembling everything back on the car. You can just work your way from the bottom of the list back up to the top and know with a high degree of confidence that you put everything back in the proper place, in the proper order. And because you cataloged all your nuts and bolts, you're not going to have any leftover hardware wondering where it's supposed to go on the car. I know this seems very elementary, but this really made the repair job very smooth, gave me a high degree of confidence that I put everything back together. It's very simple. I would highly recommend doing this. It's extremely simple, extremely effective though. The last piece of advice would be just to allocate a proper amount of time. I would suggest 2 full days to do this repair, especially if this is your very first time and you're doing it by yourself. You really want to give yourself enough time to be able to do this repair slowly and methodically. Day 1, I disassembled everything down to the oil pan gasket. Day 2, I put the new gasket on, put the new bolts on, and reassembled the car back together. So that really helped make sure that there wasn't a time crunch. I wasn't stressed out. I really enjoyed being able to do this repair, so I'd suggest 2 full days to do this repair. Starting out, you're going to need a floor jack. Jack stands. So I would recommend getting 3 sets of jack stands, so 6 total. 4 are going to be used to jack up the car, and then the last 2 are going to be used to support the steering column. So when you remove the steering column from the subframe, it's just going to be dangling there, which you don't want. You don't want to stress the components or any of those joints. So you want to be able to prop that up off the ground. The last piece that you're going to need as far as engine support is going to be this engine support bar. So what we're doing here is dropping the subframe, and the subframe provides structural integrity for the engine. So if you drop the subframe, you're dropping all of that structural integrity, which is why we need this engine support bar. So before we drop the subframe, we need to support the engine from the top, which is where this comes in handy. This is an absolute must. $70 from Harbor Freight. Your life, your health, your safety is worth a lot more than $70. So now I'm just going to walk through the basic tools here. Ziploc bags and Sharpies. This is going to be to catalog all of your nuts and bolts. Safety glasses, gloves, some painter's tape or masking tape. This is going to help remove the engine mount nut. Need some pick tools for all the clips and hoses. You're going to need all of your ratchets, so 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, all the accessories, universal joint adapters, adapters to go from drive size to drive size, as well as your extensions, a set of metric sockets and metric wrenches, the external torque sockets, socket. Brake cleaner here and some PB blaster, a breaker bar, electric impact or pneumatic impact. These are nice to have, they're not necessary. So when we take out the engine mount nut, what you need to do is get access from the top and go down into the engine bay. What you can do is just string together a bunch of extensions, or what you can do is go out and buy a 2-foot extension. Save you a little bit of time, a little bit of hassle. The last thing I'm going to talk about here is these quick disconnect set for AC or fuel lines. And if you have a PCV drain hose that goes down into the oil pan, this is what's going to save you, specifically the 1/2 inch quick disconnect. If you've had any experience with the PCV system or the PCV hoses, you know how brittle and breakable these are. And if you happen to break a PCV drain hose, you have to go buy a new PCV drain hose, wait for it to get shipped, and you have to take the intake manifold off to replace it. This was a lifesaver and worth every penny. I got this for $12 at O'Reilly Auto. A screw extractor kit. I sheared a oil pan bolt and the bolt was stuck in the engine block. Thankfully I had the screw extractor kit to help get that aluminum bolt out. So now that we covered all the tools, let's move on to the actual DIY. I call this a modified DIY because I am just getting access to the motor mounts. I don't need nearly the clearance to remove the motor mount as I would if I needed to remove the oil pan. So I'm going to tell you every single nut and bolt that you're going to need to remove, but I might not actually remove those bolts since I don't need the clearance that you need. I'm going to start from the very beginning, and what I did was take my handwritten notes here and I transcribed them into a Google Doc or PDF. That'll be in the description below. I'm just going to start from the top of the list and work my way down. I know some of these things are going to be obvious, so I'll gloss over things that I think are obvious and focus on things that I think require more detail. The first thing you're going to want to do is, if you don't have an electric impact or pneumatic impact, is to break the torque of the front wheel lug bolts. Step 2 is going to be to jack up the car, and you want to jack it up as high as you safely can with your jack stands. If you've only jacked the car up enough to just do an oil change, I'm going to spend just a second to explain how to jack the vehicle up safely to the highest point. I have 2 jack stands here. Imagine this is the front and this is the back. So first thing you're going to want to do is jack the car up on all 4s at the lowest or near the lowest setting. Once you get the car up on all 4 jack stands, you want to go around to the back where the differential is and jack the car up that way so the back is slightly higher than the front. Adjust your jack stand accordingly so it's slightly higher than the front. You're going to bring the floor jack around to the front side, and then from the subframe in the center, jack the front up so it's slightly higher than the rear. Then you're going to repeat this process, come back around to the back, to the differential, jack it up so it's slightly higher than the front, and keep repeating this process so you teeter-totter back and forth until you get to the highest points that your jack can safely stand. Before we get into the step-by-step taking off every single bolt, I want to kind of step back and just think about the objective and how we're going to get there. What we're trying to do is drop the oil pan from the underside of the car so we can replace the gasket. But right now the subframe is in the way. What does a subframe do? The subframe connects from frame rail to frame rail and provides support for the engine. In order for us to drop the subframe, we have to transfer the support of the engine from the subframe to the engine support bar. Once the engine is supported by the engine support bar, we can start to remove everything that's attached to the subframe. We're going to have to disconnect the engine from the subframe via the engine mounts and the engine mount nuts. Disconnect the control arms, the sway bar, the steering column, any hoses that attach to that. Once we remove all those components, disconnect the engine, it'll be safe to drop the subframe. So just wanted to give a brief overview of what we're trying to do and how we're going to get there. So now that the vehicle is all jacked up at the highest point and you've broken the torque in the front wheel bolts, what you want to do is drain the oil. So 17mm socket. While the oil is draining, go ahead and remove both front wheels. After that, what we need to do is start getting rid of the garbage plastic stuff on top. Remove the corner caps, those are just clips. Remove the cabin air filter and housing, 8mm bolts. And this is going to give us access to get down to the engine mount nuts. Take off the air intake system here. So starting with this air scoop right here, there's two T20 bolts that you want to unscrew. You disconnect the air box from this air intake boot. So you have a 6mm hose clamp, the mass airflow sensor, just use a pick tool, two 10mm bolts right here. Take that off, remove the air box as well. Remove the radiator fan, which is going to allow us to get access to these coolant line bolts that attach the lines to the subframe. To remove the radiator fan, disconnect the two electrical connectors. This big one that has tabs on the side that you push towards the middle, and then you have this smaller one, which is a pretty standard BMW, where you push this down and pull it straight out. There's one screw holding the radiator fan in, which is a T25 that's going to be on the top passenger side of the radiator fan. So you see there's this plastic clip that holds in this radiator fan. So what you want to do is press this tab towards the firewall and then pull the radiator fan straight out. And what that's going to do is give us access to these T30 bolts. So there's one, there's two underneath here, and then there's a third one on the side here, you can see. So you want to remove those three T30 bolts, and that will disengage the coolant line from the subframe. Remove the engine cover, 5 T45 bolts. So remove that engine cover, and this is going to allow us to be able to install the engine support hook. So you're going to want to go in your trunk, right above where the battery is, to get your engine support hook. And I took a Sharpie and just drew a line at where the bottom out is on this engine support hook. Start hand threading this into the engine, and it might come to a point where it gets a little rough on your hands. And so we'll take a breaker bar, put that in, and use this for leverage to be able to bottom this engine support hook. Before we install the engine support bar across the top, what I want to do is remove the engine mount nuts while there's nothing interfering. Here is your engine mount here, right? So it's connected to the subframe through the bottom here and through these two bolts. And your engine sits on top of here with a nut to lock it in place. So this is where your longer extension comes in handy. Take a strip of your painter's tape, sticky side facing the socket, and be able to just kind of push that into the socket and roll those sides over. When you go down and unscrew that motor mount nut, when you pull it straight up, the nut is not going to fall from the socket because you have a little bit of extra material between the outside of the nut and the inside of the socket that's going to create enough friction that it's not going to drop out of the socket. The engine mount nuts are going to be straight down from where your positive terminal is, and then also just behind the power steering reservoir. So if you can see right there, right about where the socket is, that's going to be your passenger side engine mount and engine mount nut. So we're going to get that on there. Just going to get our ratchet and break that loose. So now when we pull this straight up, the nut comes with it. Repeat the same process on the driver's side here. Straight from the back of the power steering reservoir and look straight down and basically get on top of that nut there. Break that loose as well. And pull that out. Pull that straight up, and the nut comes right with it. I want to be able to practice what I preach here, so I'm going to take my 2 motor mount nuts that I just removed from the car. I'm going to write down engine mount nuts, 16 millimeters, so I know which socket size to grab. I'm just going to place those in a safe place, and since I've already put all the steps down, otherwise I'd write down, you know, your motor mount nuts, 16 millimeter plus tape. So now that we have pretty much everything taken off of the top that we need to, we can install the engine support bar. Get this nice and centered right over the engine support hook. So I'm just going to get that very loosely in position. Okay, and if you notice that it's slightly tilted down, so what we need to do is loosen these bolts. So now we have the ability to angle this back and forth, so we want to make sure this is nice and perpendicular with the ground. Okay, so now we have the angle that we want, and we're going to tighten these down. And this is going to start to take all of the structural support off of the subframe and transfer it to this engine support bar. Before I lock this down into place, jack up the engine slightly. So I'm just going to jack this up slightly. The engine support bar is loose again, so we're going to retighten this down. When we drop the floor jack, all that weight is going to go back onto this bar. We disconnected the engine from the subframe, and now we have to disconnect all the other components from the subframe in order to drop it. Disconnect the upper and lower control arm from the subframe. So both of them have an 18 millimeter bolt. On the upper control arm, it has a self-retaining nut, so you don't need to put anything on the back end. You can just take a breaker bar with an 18 millimeter socket, loosen that and remove that bolt. For the lower control arm, you need to get an 18 millimeter wrench and an 18 millimeter socket. Put one on the head of the bolt and one on the nut, and be able to undo that bolt and remove it. Disengage the sway bar from the sway bar link at this joint right here. So I replaced my sway bar link, but here is the BMW one. And so just to kind of show you how to do this, get a 17 millimeter wrench, put that on this nut, and then you have a 16 millimeter on the actual nut here that you're going to use to unscrew that from the sway bar. So once you do that, you can disengage the sway bar link from the sway bar, and then we'll move to the underside of the car. So the first thing we're going to do is there is a black kind of triangle brace. It has 6 16 millimeter bolts that we're going to go underneath the car and remove those bolts and remove that brace. We need to remove the sway bar blocker, this sway bar, this power steering hose, and then also the steering column right here. This is a 10 millimeter Power steering. Now we can get access to these sway bar bolts. There's 4 13mm bolts. They're going to undo. Disconnect the steering column from the subframe. So this has 2 bolts, which has a E12 socket on this side, and then up above you're going to need to use a 16mm wrench to be able to get on the nut from the other side. And what you want to do is just remove these 2 bolts right here. This is where having the extra set of jack stands comes in handy. So this steering column slides into this groove on the subframe. So after you remove those bolts, you're going to push out the steering column, take your jack stands from both sides, and prop up the steering column. So again, E12 16mm wrench on the other side. Remove those 2 bolts, pull that straight out, and just prop that on top of the jack stands there. We pretty much have everything disconnected. We disconnected the engine from the subframe, we disconnected the coolant lines from the subframe, the steering rack, both control arms, power steering, sway bar. So now we are ready to remove the bolts that attach the subframe to the frame rails. Before we do that, we just want to take your floor jack, position it underneath the subframe before you start removing any subframe bolts. This is also why it's nice to have those jack stands supporting the steering column, because you can have one on each side of the floor jack without interfering, having the floor jack come in from the center. Good amount of tension on to the subframe. So now it's time to remove the subframe bolts, which are going to be 6 18mm bolts. So my impact driver wasn't able to undo these bolts, so this is where the breaker bar comes in handy. So now that I broke the torque on those, I'm just going to come back with the impact and take them out. You have 3 different size bolts here, back, middle, front. So now we have everything disconnected from the subframe disconnected from the frame rail. Now what you want to do is to slowly lower the floor jack and stop it every couple of inches. Check everything around and make sure that no hoses or anything's stressed or strained. So we dropped the subframe, and mine didn't drop all that much because I had the control arm still connected and I didn't need that much room. I was able to get the motor mounts out. But for you, the subframe will drop quite a bit, and then now you have access to your oil pan gasket. Your subframe will be dropped a lot lower than mine. I just had to remove these motor mounts, which I was able to do, but I still wanted to point out how to remove this oil pan. Disconnect the electrical connector here. There's 2 tabs on the side that you want to squeeze together and pull out. You have a 10mm bolt right here, which is going to be the ground cable that you want to disconnect that too. Up there you can see where my light is shining on. That's the oil pan tube, and then the PCV drain hose right there. So you can see that is the most frustrating part of this whole entire process, at least for me. I do actually have footage of me using this quick disconnect, which I'll show now. Okay. It's kind of hard to see here, but I'm just going to take this quick disconnect and push that into there as far as I can. Oh, there we go. I'm gonna get at it from the top here. Go down in from the engine bay, reach down, find that PCB drain hose, and pull it off of the oil pan. I had to remove this support bar here, which just it made it a lot easier that I could get my hands down there, because it is a really long, hard to reach spot. So this is a E14 on this bolt right here, and then right here is going to be an E18. Still feel a little bit of a gap, so I'm trying. Oh yeah. Oh. So from there it's pretty straightforward. Undo all the oil pan bolts, drop the oil pan, take it out from underneath the car, clean it up, put your new gasket on there, and then put it back on the car with your new oil pan bolts. I want to share one more experience. I hand tightened all of the oil pan bolts back onto the engine. I went to go torque down my first bolt. My larger torque wrench only goes down to 10 foot-pounds, so I wasn't able to use it. I bought this inch-pound torque wrench from Harbor Freight. The torque spec is 6 foot-pounds, which is 72 inch-pounds. I felt like I was putting too much pressure, but I didn't hear a click. I should have stopped, but I just kept on turning slowly until I heard the click, and I heard a snap, and that was the aluminum bolt snapping. Part of it's still in the engine, so my heart absolutely sank. Luckily, I was able to pretty easily extract it with the screw extraction kit. So I re-tightened everything down by hand. I'm not sure what advice to give on torquing down those oil pan bolts, especially at 6 foot-pounds. Find another video, another resource to get advice on that. I'm not going to blame Harbor Freight. Most likely was a user error. Again, I couldn't trust it. So if you have the subframe down and you have extra time, this is a great opportunity to change out some components that, with the subframe down, make it super easy. The engine mounts, the sway bar bushings. If you're down there and you got the car all the way up, you could change out your transmission mounts. I think the best thing though is the water pump and thermostat. I don't know if you've ever watched any water pump thermostat replacement videos, but they're really hard to get to those hoses, pull them off the thermostat, and a water pump, it seems like kind of a nightmare. Because you have the subframe down, you can get access to pretty much everything. You can get access to every hose, be able to undo those clips, be able to pull off the hoses. So I was able to do the water pump and thermostat replacement in a matter of about an hour, hour and a half, and it was very easy. So definitely I would consider, if you're at 100,000 plus miles, which usually all E90s at this point are, consider replacing the water pump and thermostat. It is super easy with the subframe down. Really make this oil pan gasket and subframe drop worth it. The 6 subframe bolts are going to be 108 Newton meters. The steering column torque spec is 56 Newton meters. The sway bar to the subframe is 21 Newton meters. This black reinforcement strut that has 6 16mm bolts are going to be 56 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. The sway bar linked to the sway bar is going to be 58 Newton meters. The upper control arm bolt here is going to be 68 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. So you can either use a Sharpie to mark on the bolts and on the subframe where 90 degrees would be, but I can just see in the bolt head by this number 2 just past the 3 o'clock position. So I'm going to turn it 90 degrees to just past the 6 o'clock position. So we got the apex by the 2 just past the 6 o'clock position. The lower control arm is going to be 100 Newton meters plus 90 degrees. And I'm going to repeat the same process where you can see some writing. It looks like the number 8 at the 6 o'clock position, so I'm going to turn that to the 9 o'clock position. If you happen to do your engine mounts, they're going to be 28 Newton meters. Well, that is all I have for the oil pan gasket replacement video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something, gave you a little bit of confidence to try and take on this oil pan gasket. Just make sure you do the proper amount of preparation, buy the correct tools and parts, and you should be good to go. I know you can do this. See you next time.